Apollo 13, the drama that almost ended in tragedy. Did you know? Imagine that you go to a totally unknown world full of mysteries and possibilities. This is exactly how the Apollo 13 mission began on April 11, 1970. Three incredibly courageous astronauts, Captain James Lovell, who was already a veteran of space missions, pilot John Swigert, always calm and prepared, and the engineer Fred Haise, who was a genius at solving technical problems, were ready for a trip that promised to be historic. The goal? Land on the moon and explore its desert landscapes, places that no human being has seen up close before. They would be the third team to have this honor, following in the footsteps of the Apollo 11 and 12 missions. There was enormous expectation surrounding this mission, not only from the astronauts themselves, but also from the entire NASA team and people around the world. All the planning was done, down to the smallest detail. What they would do upon landing, what lunar rock samples they would collect, and even where they would plant the United States flag. The Apollo 13 spacecraft was like a technological fortress, equipped with the most advanced space engineering at the time. Inside it, every button, every panel, and every wire had an essential function. Before leaving, the astronauts went through a rigorous training routine, preparing themselves for any situation that could happen in space. They were confident and eager to make history once again. And then, with millions of eyes fixed on the sky, the Saturn V rocket roared as it left Earth, carrying with it the dreams and hopes of all humanity. The mission seemed to go along perfectly, like an exciting adventure that was just beginning. Everyone believed that it would be another success for NASA, another step in the conquest of space. But, as in every great adventure, the true test of courage and skill was yet to come. And this test would be much more challenging than anyone could imagine. The Apollo 13 trip was going according to plan, and everything seemed to be under control until, on the second day of the mission, something totally unexpected and terrifying happened. It was April 13th, 1970, and the spacecraft was more than 300,000 kilometers away from Earth, already on its way to the moon. Suddenly, an explosion shook the spacecraft. One of the oxygen tanks, a vital part of the system that kept the astronauts alive and the spacecraft running, had exploded. This oxygen was not only crucial for the astronauts to breathe, but it also powered the fuel cells that generated electricity for the spacecraft. At the moment of the explosion, the onboard instruments began to show serious failures, and the warning lights came on as if it were an emergency. The astronauts felt the ship shake and heard the frightening sound of the explosion. They knew they were in a critical situation, and things were about to get even worse. It was then that astronaut Jack Swigert, remaining calm, delivered the message that would become one of the most famous phrases in the history of space exploration. "Houston, we've had a problem." With these few words, he was communicating to Mission Control on Earth that the situation was extremely serious. The ship was rapidly losing oxygen, and without oxygen, not only would the astronauts' breathing be at risk, but also their ability to operate the ship. On Earth, the NASA team went into emergency mode, with engineers and technicians racing to understand what had happened and how they could help the crew survive. Everyone knew they were facing one of the most difficult challenges ever faced in the history of space missions. Every second counted, and everyone needed to think quickly and act precisely. After the explosion, the Apollo 13 astronauts found themselves in an extremely complicated and dangerous situation. The oxygen tank explosion had seriously damaged the ship, leaving it without sufficient power and compromising several critical systems. Among these systems was the one that filtered carbon dioxide, the gas that everyone exhales when breathing. Normally, the ship was equipped to remove this gas from the air, but with the damage, the system was not working properly. The accumulation of carbon dioxide was a direct threat to the lives of astronauts. If left unchecked, the level of gas in the air would rise rapidly, and they could suffocate inside the ship itself. With limited oxygen and scarce energy, the situation was desperate. They were literally racing against time to find a solution. On Earth, NASA engineers and technicians sprang into action. They knew they needed to be creative and fast. There was no room for error. Using all the knowledge and experience they had, they began to think of ways to solve the problem with what the astronauts had available on the ship. It was a moment of pure ingenuity. The solution they developed was both simple and brilliant. Using common materials that were on the spacecraft, such as duct tape, plastic bags, and parts of the spacesuit, the astronauts built an improvised filter for carbon dioxide. This filter, which looked like something out of a science experiment, worked. He was able to clean the air inside the ship, ensuring the astronauts had clean air to breathe. This improvised solution is remembered to this day as a stunning example of how creativity and ingenuity can overcome even the most daunting challenges. With the air breathable again, the astronauts were able to continue their journey back to Earth, knowing that, despite all the difficulties, there was still hope. Each problem that arose needed to be faced with the same determination and skill, and the creation of this filter was one of the most important moments in the mission to rescue Apollo 13. After the explosion that damaged the service module, the Apollo 13 crew faced a harsh reality. The original mission to land on the moon was out of the question. Now the only priority was getting back to Earth safely. However, with the ship damaged, this task became incredibly complicated. Many of the automatic systems, which would normally do most of the navigation work, were inoperative. This meant astronauts had to take control manually, making complex calculations and precise adjustments to ensure they made it home. One of the biggest difficulties was the need to use the moon's gravity as a kind of slingshot to propel the ship back to Earth. This maneuver, known as gravity assist, required Apollo 13 to pass through the moon's orbit at an exact angle and speed. If they missed, even by a small margin, they could be thrown off course, becoming lost in space forever. The moon's gravity was both an ally and a challenge. It could help the ship gain the speed needed for return, but any mistake could be disastrous. With automatic systems out of commission, astronauts had to turn to manual methods of navigation, something that required not only skill, but also nerves of steel. They used the ship's windows to visually align with stars and the Earth itself, performing calculations with a precision that allowed no margin for error. Using simple tools like a calculator and rulers, they made adjustments to the ship's trajectory, all while dealing with the constant pressure of time running out. To ensure they were on the right route, the crew also needed to perform engine burns at critical moments. These burns, as they were called, needed to be timed and directed with pinpoint precision to ensure the ship was pointed in the correct direction. Each of these adjustments was vital, as any deviation could mean the spacecraft would not enter Earth's atmosphere on the correct trajectory, which could result in a disaster during re-entry. This manual navigation, carried out under extreme conditions of stress and uncertainty, demonstrated not only the incredible skill of the astronauts, but also the value of the exhaustive training they had received. They were literally piloting the ship by hand, with their lives and the mission depending on every decision they made. Thanks to their precision and determination, Apollo 13 managed to maintain the correct course, ensuring that despite all obstacles, they returned to Earth on the right path. The story of Apollo 13's navigation is a testament to human resilience and the ability to overcome seemingly insurmountable challenges. With all automatic systems failing around them, the crew showed that even in the most adverse circumstances, it is possible to find a way to return home. During their return to Earth, the Apollo 13 astronauts faced very difficult conditions inside the spacecraft. Because of the damage, they had to save as much energy, water, and food as possible. This meant that they needed to ration, that is, use just a little of each thing so that it would last until the end of the trip. Furthermore, without enough power, the spacecraft became very cold. and the astronauts spent most of their time shivering. They also had to deal with the carbon dioxide that built up in the air, so they had to stay vigilant at all times to keep the air safe to breathe. These challenges made the return journey even more difficult and dangerous. Imagine being in the most important moment of your life, where everything depends on a single movement. It was like this for the Apollo 13 astronauts when they were about to re-enter Earth's atmosphere. They knew that to return home, they needed to cross a layer of super hot air around the planet, and this would only be possible if the command module called Odyssey was in perfect condition. Everyone on Earth and on the ship was holding their hearts because no one was sure if the Odyssey had been damaged during the explosion. If it were, it might not be able to withstand the extreme heat of re-entry, and that would be fatal. The astronauts prepared themselves, checked every detail, and then everything went silent. It was a silence that seemed to last an eternity, while everyone waited anxiously. Suddenly, after a few minutes that seemed like hours, a voice came over the radio. "This is Odyssey. We're fine." An explosion of joy swept through mission control, and everyone knew the worst was over. Odyssey had held on, and the astronauts were finally on their way home, safe and sound. After all the challenges they faced, the Apollo 13 astronauts finally returned home safely. On April 17, 1970, the ship landed in the Pacific Ocean, and they were rescued by United States Navy teams. It was a moment of great relief and celebration, both for the astronauts and for everyone who followed the mission on Earth. Although Apollo 13 failed to land on the Moon, as was the initial objective, the mission was considered a great success for another reason. It showed the world the incredible ability to adapt, teamwork and problem-solving, both of the astronauts and from the NASA team. The lessons learned from this mission helped make future space travel safer and reinforced the idea that, even in the most difficult situations, the human spirit can overcome great obstacles.